Hey guys, and welcome back to the Vessel of Light podcast. I'm your host, Mia Ray DeLeo, and today we are doing part 2 of Matt's testimony.
Yeah, I'm super excited. We really won't be taking too much time to go backwards at all. So if you're interested in hearing part 1, definitely go back and listen to that, because today we're just going to be diving straight into part 2, which is right after I was saved.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you can just jump right into what happened right after that. Like you said, go back and watch the first episode to see what happened beforehand, but I'm excited for the second part for sure.
Me too. So going right to that point, coming out of the baptismal waters, it was a very surreal experience. There were a lot of things that changed in my life very rapidly. I think when I think about that time, God was doing so much, and one of the major kind of takeaways from that, if you're listening, is there was this radical shift in my life, and I think God does that for all of us at one point or another. There are things that God exposes in you and that you know that you need to change.
Yeah.
Except for me, it was like all at one time.
Yeah.
Like this was not a gradual process. I know for some people it kind of comes in gradual
Waves.
process of waves. Yeah, like seasons. This was not that. It was very immediate. It was very direct. It was very radical. And so much of it was I had to, one, unlearn a lot of behaviors and things that I had been practicing for a very long time. Two, I had to come to terms with the fact that baptism and even coming into the faith was nothing like I thought it was going to be. I kind of thought I was going to come up out of the baptismal waters and you're like, oh, you leave the dead man behind, and you know, like this whole idea of the being buried with Christ and then rising with Christ, and you're publicly professing your faith and stepping out in obedience, and you're wanting accountability. There's so many different parts of baptism. And then I remember thinking, I'm going to be so different now because of this. And then it's like very quickly you're like, things are different, but many things are still the same. Like I'm not perfect. The dead man's still here. I'm still struggling with things. I still need help. And there was so much of that, honestly. At first, I needed good friends and good accountability to walk me through so many different life changes. And it was like an amazing time in general, because I was reading the Bible for the first time by myself, cover to cover. I was learning so many different things, and like I said, unlearning different things. I thought I knew what was in the Bible from previous, times with it. I was very skeptical by nature, struggled with doubt a lot, and then this time I'm reading the Bible and I was frankly shocked by it. I wasn't reading it maliciously. I was engaging with it very genuinely, and it was just so eye-opening. The things that Christ said in it were shocking in so many ways to me. And it was like it was meant for me at that time. Mm-hmm. And very quickly I realized that that overwhelming love that I had for people, that like newness of that was translated into me serving, into me spending a lot of time in small groups and Bible studies and being involved with youth, and just going and observing how things worked in the Christian faith, like on a very deep level, not on anything surface level, just like very deeply being invested with people. And it was amazing, honestly. It was such a awesome time of growth and change. And like I said, some things were still there. Like I was still working my job, and that was still getting crazier, but I was also learning and growing in things that I had just never been exposed to. And people were praying with me about things, and I changed in a very radical way. And it was hard too because of that, because I knew that people that I used to know lived here, and they probably thought all kinds of things about me because I was very publicly not a Christian for a long time, and I made no bones about it. Like I didn't pretend to ever be. And at the same time, I had a lot of friends that I was very close with. This was another very hard transitionary period of like, once I was this way, like I couldn't just go back to life the way that it was. I had to change. And I had friends that I was close with that my overall heart, my overall mind, the way I felt and thought were very different now. And it quickly made me realize that I couldn't be around them and the behaviors, and I needed to change. And so part of that was, realizing our interests aren't really aligning anymore, and I'm gonna have to give some of this up, and some relationships you had to let go of because you're not pursuing them for the right reasons.
I feel like God's timing was perfect in that moment for you, because whenever you had those relationships, that's really who you had to be around. But whenever you decided, hey, I'm going to start hanging around these people and being in different Bible studies, he surrounded you around a group of people, like you said, who wanted to disciple you and wanted to really grow you in your faith.
Yep.
So I am sure it was very hard having to almost put a boundary or separate or cut off some people in your life. But God had other people lined up for you as well. But during that transition time, I'm sure there was time where doubt kind of creeped in of, there's these people that I'm close with and I used to see every single day, and now my lifestyle is not matching up with them, and am I in the wrong? Or did you feel like there was a lot of doubt that crept in, or do you feel like because of the people that you had surrounded you, it wasn't as much?
No, there was doubt for sure. It was hard, especially not just like the whole friends angle, but also like the work life angle too was very hard, and it made me doubt a lot of things because, reading something in a book about the way that you're, supposed to be walking, because in this, like, just to highlight this little part right here, because I feel like it goes so perfectly with this.
Yeah.
There's a difference between just being saved, but also like pursuing Jesus as a disciple.
Yeah.
There's a very big difference between the two things. And for my friends at the time, and even like I said, that work, the stark difference between going to church, going to small group, going and being around these people who are just love filled and Christ centered and wanting to live so radically different from the people around them. And then you go back to your old friend groups, you go to work, and things are so different. And it's shocking how you go to this reality and you're like, wow, people are kind of miserable at work. They're grinding for things. They're not really happy to be here. They're, at the end of the day, a lot of them are just searching for that paycheck. And if it weren't for that, they literally would have no interest in what they were doing at all. And it makes them miserable. So I remember, a lot of doubt creeping in at different points of time. And I was always, especially in the form of, as I was getting more involved, I felt called to do things that I was so not, I never thought I would do anything like that.
Right.
So I was very skeptical at different points because I thought, there's no way that I'm like this. Just, it can't be me. Like, I've been away for too long, and you make up all these different reasons why, and then on top of that, you're like, I go back to my regular job and I do all these other things, and there's no way that it could be me being called to do all of this because the rest of my life never looked like this, and now I have this big other part of my life that doesn't resemble any of this, and because you go back to the office and it wasn't important really about. it just wasn't. So there were lots of doubts though. There were lots of things that crept in all along.
Well, and I'm sure the more time that you spent with whichever group, whether it was the group at work or the group at church or at Bible studies, that's why I feel like it's so important, like your core group, and it talks about, that who you keep close in the Bible is because, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And birds of a feather flock together. And it's so important that you are aware of who your closest group is and who's influencing you, and who you have in your corner. Because if it is people who have a different mindset and their mindset isn't, I want to follow Christ or be closer to him, it's easy to fall into those other thought processes if you don't have that support group. Not saying you can't have friends who aren't believers, because you have a lot of friends that aren't believers. And,
of course.
They get to be a part of our lives, and that's awesome, and we love that. It's just maybe they can't be your only friends or that core group.
Well, I think a lot about Christ and the apostles whenever I think about that idea of like he has this core 3, then there are the 12 overall, and this very simple idea that you have your tight knit group. There are all kinds of other people that he interacts with, and it calls that out on a regular basis in Scripture, that he hangs out with people that the Jewish leaders and Pharisees considered undesirables, essentially, in every possible way. And the thing is, Christ never shuns those people, but he does still have his core group of disciples that he hangs around, and I think it's very appropriate, because it was kind of like that. I mean, for a while there were lots of people that I had to be like, okay, I can hang around you, but only so much. And not because I don't like you or whatever, but very simply just because our whole thought process was so different. My mind was being transformed and renewed by Christ on a daily basis. And I just thought differently about everything. And it made being around those people at first, especially when you're weaker and you're trying to be held accountable, and then you're around the people maybe who live for the weekends or whatever it is, and that's their only thing that they're excited about is the next Friday night. And it's so hard to jive with that when you're around people who are so love filled and so grace filled, and they take every day as a new blessing and a new opportunity, and they just don't reflect that kind of lifestyle at all. They live slowly and intentionally for Jesus, and it was, like I said, it was a startling difference. And so walking through those first few months was crazy, let alone the idea of feeling called to do something that I was not really familiar or comfortable with at first, and seeing that I had these gifts that even other people were pointing out about my ability to learn, and then turn around and like teach something that I'd learned. And I'd always, like, when I was younger, I thought, oh, I want to be a professor and I want to be a teacher, but you never think about how those things could translate into like spiritual gifts of preaching or teaching. And then you start getting into environments where you're like, oh, I'm actually understanding and doing well with turning this whole idea around and then presenting it to someone in an understandable format, maybe in a different way, and so they can get it too. And that was like, wow, I'm actually good at this. And I didn't, honestly, I don't know why, but I guess just because it was the Bible, and I just never thought that would be something I would be good at, from before. You just are like, this is weird. It didn't make any sense. Which, you think maybe it'd be obvious. You're like, oh yeah, you were interested in teaching, whatever. But not for me at the time. I was skeptical of all of that by nature, and I had a good friend who, once I had explained some of that to them, that desire to want to preach and to teach, and sort of like an aspiration of that, they were like, cool, so like how is your current like position and what you're doing really driving that forward? And that was a huge challenge, because I remember I left that and I thought, well, a lot of people go to church and do whatever and serve, and they've got jobs, and it's like, I can't give up my job. I'm not going to do that. And I remember thinking, I'll just do both. I'll do I'll come in and I'll serve and I'll do youth and I'll minister to people, and like I'll just be there for any way that I possibly can be. And I'll go back to work, and that's just what I'll do. And then very quickly, like that fall, things became crazy, and it was not easy to do both. I was missing all kinds of different church things because work got crazier, and I went from an hourly to a salaried position and started working a lot more, and and that came in waves too. That came in kind of these like doses of, as I'm reading through scripture, and not just reading it, but also understanding it and then applying it to my life, seeing the stark contrast of things, and it really like hitting you in different scenarios and situations where you're thinking, wow, this is so different than what I want to do, and I don't want to be caught in another situation where I'm like, this is very uncomfortable, or, this is not what I want to pursue. And I remember that fall was so hard because there were so many times where people were calling and texting me at work, where are you at? Are you going to come to the thing? And you're like, I can't, because I'm at work, and it's just normal. Everybody does work. You can't get away from this idea. And it's hard because I feel like whenever I tell my story sometimes, especially when it comes to work, there's weird feelings about, everybody has to work, and like, I totally understand that. I don't want to ever say that people don't have to, because it's true that you do. And I think even this is a weird idea too, but God didn't curse people to work. He created man to do work. So there's a odd idea there too. It's just, we have twisted the whole idea of work though into our identity, because we've tied it into wealth and the creation of wealth, and no longer just, well, I'm working for my needs. Like, we work exorbitantly because we want crazy and exorbitant things, and that's what we desire after. And that's what I was desiring after. I wanted the American dream. I wanted the whole materialistic lifestyle. I had a plan and a track, and there were things that I wanted to and aspired to. And now all of a sudden, here's Christ telling me that I can't serve two masters, that I can't love and serve money and then also do the same thing with God. And I'm going to end up hating one or the other. So work was getting really crazy, and it was a stark difference. It was hard to navigate. I kept saying I could do both things. I could serve and do this thing. And then God kept showing me slowly as time went on that I wasn't able to do both.
Yeah. And I think the biggest thing is that you had a calling of ministry on your life. You felt like God was calling you into ministry.
Yes.
And that's like a big difference for a lot of people, is you felt that calling on your life.
Yep. And
you said, you know what, I'll just try to do both. And then the enemy made it very, very apparent by making work very crazy for you, and you physically not being able to do both.
Yeah, I was being very sucked into that, like kind of like a vortex, and it was getting crazier. And then I was like, I literally won't have time to do this other stuff. I mean, outside of just a basic Sunday thing, and I kept thinking, that's not what I want to do, because that's a whole other part of that. Is in this radical shift of my life, there was a big radical change in the way that I wanted to follow. Yeah. So it's just hard, because that whole time period too, in the fall, I lost my grandpa, and that was difficult too because I was brand new in the faith, and it was sweet in that I was now a believer, and he had been a practicing Catholic his whole life, and even up to the end, we had conversations about his relationship with Christ, and and so that was sweet in that way. But it was hard to be still brand new in your faith and already walking through losing someone that you had there your entire life. And I know I talked about them a little bit before because they were like there with the Catholic Church and had confirmed me, and so they'd always been present in my life. My grandparents, and my grandpa dying was very hard too, and that was honestly very early on in my faith walk. So
and it probably, that happening probably gave you another like perspective shift on life as well, and how before, whenever you viewed death, it was a whole nother type of feeling, I'm sure, that you had, of course, grief and all of those things, but this was grief, but also you had hope as well, and that was probably a really big, almost like an epiphany moment, or just a moment where it was like, this is a different perspective to look at life.
And it also gave me a new kind of like even more, I guess you could say radical, but I mean, it's inspired me to live more for God. Like it made me want to live a little more dangerously because I thought, man, eternity's coming for all of us. Even though he lived a long time, I thought like, I'm looking eventually at the promise of not having tomorrow, and I want to start living for God like that. I want to start living for God like just boldly. That led me to be very on fire for Christ. And when you're on fire for Christ, and for anything really, when you're passionate about things, you can be dealing with a lot of truth and not a lot of grace, and you can burn people around you. And so that was a hard portion of my early walk, because my family, I'm sure I affected them. And you just, when you're awakened to certain biblical realities, and then you see people operate in different ways, and they're in different parts of their faith walk and whatever, and you're like, well, why isn't everybody just doing this and doing that, following exactly God's word, and you're trying to change, and you're like all radical, and then the next thing you know, you're hurting the people around you because you're so full of truth, but you're not giving them any grace in the place that they're at in their walk. And I do remember that was like a hard portion of early believing for me, is that you get so stuck on the truth portion, and then you're like, oh wait, like I have got to love people well through that. I've got to equally measure out grace with that. And that's like a tangible, practical thing too, that I very much grew in as time went on. Not saying that was super easy at first, but the important thing is, though, as all of this was developing and changing that fall, I was put in a really hard place, like rock in a hard place, between wanting to leave work, stay at work, go to church, do things, and I've been very challenged in that. And as spring rolled around, it became more and more apparent that work was going to keep pulling me away from following what I wanted to do, and ultimately the calling I thought I had in my life. And there was a new opportunity that came up, and I kind of turned everything around as that was coming up. I sort of turned like the whole thing and said, I'm going to go instead, and going to pursue God, and I want to try to see what this calling looks like. And I started pursuing active ministry, and tried to I wanted to learn, so I started interning and volunteering. And in March I stepped away from my job. So that next spring I made the decision to really radically step out and go after take that leap of faith, if you will, and go after the whole walk with God. And what is amazing about that is it actually, I thought it was going to be about, my role in ministry and all of that. And what I think God did that was even greater than any of that was he introduced me to my wife.
Yeah.
And we never would have met
No,
had I not taken that bold step out, because I was busy. I couldn't go to the groups, couldn't do whatever.
Yeah.
And she actually started attending in that like springtime. So I met my wife through Bible study, and that was
And like you said, work was taking away from all of that, and just like God's provision with that, with even in a couple of months, was just crazy. And obviously, we've been together 6 years, and it was such a God thing. Our story of how we met and mutual friends, and I started going to that Bible study, and I wasn't even going to that church, and it was crazy how God clearly ordained all of that to happen. And it's just so neat how he weaved our story together. So it was just really awesome. But like that could be a whole nother episode in itself, is how our story together, but just that part of how
and
happened.
like the cliff notes, I guess, of that is that we met through that Bible study, and we were not we didn't really date very long. I told Mia very upfront that I wanted to marry her if we were gonna date. I was like, I don't want to mess around. I'm like totally on the other side of all of that, and I was like, it's if it's gonna be at all, it's gonna be serious.
Yeah, and I mean, I was the same way. If I was dating someone, it was for marriage, and I was already praying for a husband at that point. I had a list of everything that I was looking for in a husband, and Matt literally checked off every box in every detailed way. Yeah. So it was just really neat to see that. And we, of course, were in ministry for a lot of years together, and we would always tell our students, like, hey, just because we got married super quick does not mean you should. So we're not saying that it's like a great thing for everyone's story, but for us it was perfect and exactly what it needed to be. So it was really neat. So we got married later that year and kind of jumped into ministry together.
And we learned a lot about God's provision through things, because we were just two poor, broke, newlywed Christians, and we were just serving a lot, and God provided in amazing ways, like things that we never even would have expected. And it was such a wild time, because I had stepped out in faith, kind of completely against, like, you know, whatever the culture in general, this whole idea of grinding and the hustle and wealth and all the things that I had been about before. And I was just thinking, like, no, I'm gonna pursue ministry. I want to preach. I want to serve people. I want to do the thing that I felt like God had purposed me for in this life.
Yeah, and it's so cool, like, even in your own life, whenever you're walking through different seasons and you feel like God is calling you to something, it's crazy to see how he truly equips the called. Because before Matt was even a believer, he was studying to be a history major and a professor, and it's so neat to see how God uses his gift of teaching and place that calling of his life to be walked out. And we had such an amazing multiple years of being able, because of God's provision, to be in full-time ministry and get to do that together and open up our home and have conversations. And it's so neat to know that, and I feel like I've said this multiple times even on the podcast, even if you don't know your next steps, he does, and he truly equips the called. So if there's different things in your life that you feel like you're exceptionally good at, or people come to you for advice for, there's ways that he can use those gifts for his kingdom. So just be intentional about seeking that out and how he can use you in different ways for his kingdom. Whether if you're not a great speaker, but you're great at connecting with someone one-on-one, not in front of a whole bunch of people, be available for that. And look to see where God has placed you now. Some of the biggest questions that we've had that people ask is, how do you know God's calling? on your life. And a lot of times I say, pay attention to who he has around you and who's right next to you right now.
Yep.
And another big thing is ask yourself, what makes you cry? What makes you emotional? What makes you feel so passionate?
Yeah.
And for some people, it's children, or with some people, it's making sure that, like, specifically women are safe, or making sure that, like, addiction help. Just, there's so many things that you can be passionate about, that God places those desires on your heart so you can walk out that calling.
Yeah, and it doesn't always have to look the same way either.
Right.
It doesn't have to look like you stepping away from everything that you're doing, obviously, and
Right.
that's like a pretty radical way of doing it. But also, I've always felt like that portion of my story made so much sense because I was living so differently, and the hard shift that I needed to take to completely kind of flip around I guess God, for like to flip the script in my life, needed to be radical. It needed to be like dramatic because of what I had, just how far away and rebellious I had been living from him. And he more than did. And we spent several years at that point in active ministry, and then we went through a whole transition period out of that and thought we were moving away, and there was so many crazy things that happened in our life to get us to current, but all throughout that, God has been so faithful. In any moments of doubt, in anything that we thought that we would never overcome the next hill. And it's been amazing to look back, especially at that time in my life, from my story, to see how God brought me through that thing. And it reminds me a lot of the biblical stories of those, like when the Israelites are being even brought through the desert, and they're like, how do we get to the next thing? And God's like, do you not remember me parting the seas and bringing you through, and the fiery pillar and the cloud that's over you, and the manna I've rained down from heaven, and just all these amazing things that have, the analogy that have happened in our life that keep empowering us to pursue ministry and pursue what we believe that God's purpose is in our life, because we've seen him do miraculous things in our own life and provide in ways that have been shocking. And so at any time those fears or doubts or anything creeps up, we're just like, man, God has provided for us in major ways, and we just believe that he will continue to do so.
Absolutely. And even more recently, we've had to really put our true, our faith in God, as I transitioned with my job and everything that I've talked about previously, where we're in a season again where it just reminds me of the song, he is faithful, he will do it again, he never fails. Like, he never fails. He's never failed us. He's never failed us in the past times. And just looking at his faithfulness through that lens of looking back, has he ever failed us? Truly. Even when times were hard. Even when in the moment we thought he did. Yep. But he's always had a purpose for all of that. Yep. And just standing on that hope.
Well, and it's so encouraging thinking about like the next hill, and thinking about the next thing that God's going to bring you over, and then you look at all of the previous valleys and mountaintops that you were like, I never thought we would get over that one. Like I never, for me, it's like I never thought I'd get the opportunity to preach and do all these other things that it's like just. I never thought I'd be a student of the Bible and get to pour into people's lives and. Yeah, there's so many things that God has done that have just been amazing in my life, and that's really my whole story. Is if I could just summarize my entire story, is that God has radically changed my life. Like the good news of Jesus Christ has changed who I am, and I just thank God for it. I mean, at the end of the day, I was so lost in everything, even like reflecting just back on part one of this, how incredibly lost I was and how God pulled me out of that. And like, I resonate personally so much with the whole, the story, parable of the 99 sheep and the one, because I feel like I'm the little sheep that got away, and I'm just like out there doing my own thing, and like there's lions and wolves and scary stuff all around me, and I just keep trying to go further and further away from the flock, and then the shepherd really did come after me, and that's and I believe that's how God works. He can redeem people. He can save you out of anything that's going on. There's no point of skepticism or doubt or cynicism or atheism or whatever that he couldn't deliver you out of.
And you may have already answered this question, but I was going to end with the question of what would you say to someone that is going through probably one of the deepest valleys, darkest valleys, where they don't feel like there is any hope, or that they don't see the faithfulness. They are losing hope in the situation they're in. What would you say to someone whenever it feels like, how can I give my faith to Jesus if I see no hope? I'm in the valley.
Man, I think you have to, like, if you're really looking at some of the deepest valleys, I think you have to look at some of the stories of the Bible and look at the people that God used and the pits that they were in. You got to think about Joseph, who was literally thrown in a pit, and then he was thrown in a dungeon, and it was like God used him through all of that. You got to think about the Israelites, who spent 400 years. 400 years. That's several generations of people that didn't ever see their homeland. Yeah. And God delivered them from that. And there's no limit on his faithfulness about his promises. And so when that valley seems so incredibly deep and dark, just be reminded and encouraged that God did not write those examples in his word for nothing. He gave them to you so that you would know that when times were hard and that when things seemed desperate and there was no way out, that he would be there, and that he would be your way out, and that he would be the thing that flipped everything around for you. And man, because it can seem hopeless. There are seasons of doubt. There are dark valleys, but make no mistake that God is going to bring you through that storm. That he has another mountaintop and another valley and another mountaintop, and that's how it's going to go when you're following him. Is that even like thinking about the apostles and how they're spending that earthly life with Jesus, and it's like their whole life is so different, and then they have 3 years spent with this preacher that radically changes everything about them, and then he leaves, and then their whole life goes back into crazy flux again, and then it doesn't stop until they literally go out and spread the word all over the place, and a lot of them are put to death for it. But just thinking about the idea of how God just uses people, and he will not forget you in the thing that you're in. He will use, I think, the foolish to shame the wise. He will use the weak to shame the strong. So if you feel like you're in that valley and in that pit, just be encouraged that the Lord can still absolutely use you, because I was there. Yeah. I was in a deep, dark hole for such a long time, and miserable, and just, and God completely flip my life around and use me. And that doesn't mean that, like we were just saying, that everything has been rainbows and butterflies. Like, it's still been hard seasons and storms, and God has still seen us through every single thing. So that's my encouragement, is just look at the text, read about the people that God has used and the seasons that he's been through them with.
Yeah, and just knowing that he doesn't want you to have to do it alone.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's so good. Thank you so much for coming on and doing 2 parts to your testimony, and I'm sure you'll be on plenty of other times, and there's more parts of the story that we'll dive deeper into.
Yep.
But as always, as I always say, if you guys have any additional questions, please reach out to us. A lot of times Matt will help me with some of the questions as well that you guys have sent in. Ask us any questions that you would like. We're here. We want to build that community. And most of all, thank you so much for watching.
Yeah, thank you.
We appreciate it so much. Your comments and messages have been so encouraging.
Yep.
And we just appreciate you guys. We love you guys. I hope you have a great week. Thank you so much for joining me this week on Vessel of Light. My hope and my prayer is that this episode empowered you to be who God created you to be right in the season he has you in. If you found this episode encouraging, please share it with friends and family who might find it uplifting as well. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear how I can continue to support and encourage you in your faith journey. Stay connected with me on social media at Vessel of Light Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. And I look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a blessed week.